Knowing what Yu-Gi-Oh deck is right for you can be a bit tricky. I know it took me a long time to realize the difference between what I enjoy playing and what I'm actually good at playing. In this segment, I'm going to be talking about some of the ways to choose the right deck for you. Hello and welcome to another Yu-Gi-Oh video. This time a kind of general discussion which should help you to save time and pick decks that suit you. To kick things off, I'm going to be establishing a deck choosing system. So the first part, we're going to define a list of attributes. Next, we're going to understand what each attribute demands of a player. Then we're going to fit these attributes to the best decks in the format. And finally, we're going to self-assess in order to find what you can offer your deck and the perfect deck for you. Before I go any further, if you enjoy this video and you want to contribute to the channel, please share the video with your friends, drop me a sub, this is probably the best way to spread the ideas, and also by commenting on the video we can discuss your ideas even further. Alright, so returning to the video, we start with the attributes. Now these aren't like typical monster attributes, these are characteristics of different decks or different playstyles, and each puts a certain pressure on the pilot to exhibit necessary skills. By determining which skills you possess and assessing the best decks for the format, you can find a deck that actually suits your ability and take you to the top. So I have a list of 8 attributes which can be used to describe decks. We have memory intensive, disruptive, lockdown, control, linear, aggressive, disruptable, and staggered. Now I'm going to go through all of these individual attributes in just a minute. One thing that's very important to note from the start, there are certainly more possible attributes that could define decks, but I believe that these are probably the most important ones for determining whether or not you're a good match for a deck. And these are certainly not mutually exclusive items. You can very much have like a disruptive deck that has quite linear plays, or you can have an aggressive deck that happens to have staggered plays, that kind of thing. So let's go through what each of these means. Linear is already a pretty popular term that's used throughout the player base. Basically, it means that the deck typically tries to carry through a single play or combo. This could be like Invoked trying to normal summon Alistair every turn for advantage, or maybe it could be like the typical Goki when they go first, trying to establish that extra link in Trigate and Gumbler, or whatever you're going through, depending on what region you're in. So obviously Goki has many different combo variations, and obviously if you're going second, it doesn't really just pump out a single combo, so it's not linear in that scenario. But there is a determined best line of play to make on turn 1, so it's linear in that sense. Then linearity sort of links into the second attribute quite nicely from the topic of Goki, and this is memory intensive. So Goki involves tons of steps, and if you want to play the deck competitively, then you've got to get these combos right every single game when they come up. But you also need to know how to deal with bad hands and what is needed to take the game. This makes the deck much more focused on how much you can learn about the combos. While screwing up step 5 of your combo in a memory-intensive deck might lose you the game, in a staggered deck, you won't have this issue. Because in a staggered deck, every action is disconnected from the rest. You aren't relying on every part of your combo to go through in order for you to win, and you can afford to do things a little bit differently once in a while, just because every action that you take can bring you closer to victory, although perhaps in a more sort of unusual route than standard. Looking at disruptive decks, they have a single aim, which is to stop the opponent from doing anything, basically. They focus on establishing a board full of negates or quick effect destruction or disruption, anything that can interrupt the opposing line of play, basically. They might even just be running a ton of hand traps to disrupt opposing plays, but the focus is always on making sure that the opponent's efforts amount to absolutely nothing. On the other side are the Disruptable decks. So these are lists that lose their entire turn to one well-placed disrupt, unless of course they draw some kind of protection, which they will pick up after they experience the sort of being hit by a hand trap and losing out. Usually what they lose to is quite specific. Once again, let's go back to Goki when it was most popular. So Ghost Ogre on the Firewall, when the Mermaid is made, or Avela on the Isolde's second effect, both of these would have a serious present a serious issue to Goki just a few months ago, and that made Goki really something of a disruptable deck. It's not super generic. Then again, looking at something like Invoked, there are many ways to disrupt their lines of play, things like Vela, Ash, Infinite Impermanence, Breakthrough Skills, just tons of disrupts that actually stop the Alistair. And as a result, they've had to build the deck slightly differently in order to counter that. Just stopping the invocation search basically makes Invoked lose, or at least they used to, but obviously the deck has changed a little bit since then. Onto the aggressive decks then. So these are builds that aim to OTK or FTK. They're essentially blind to back row, in that they see every turn as an opportunity for victory, and they can often just go again the next turn if it doesn't work out. However, being blind to back row doesn't always pay off, so they often side things that would deal with disruption is what they tend to put in. So things like Denko, Red Reboot, Twin Twisters, all that kind of stuff. If an aggressive deck can stun their opponent's resources for a single turn, then they generally just sort of OTK and win immediately. So the aggressive decks do normally main some kind of hand trap prevention, like midfield breaker, mid-breaker field, that one, Call by the Grave, that kind of stuff, just because hand traps have proved especially popular in the past, and these decks sometimes lose to that kind of thing. So in a sense, they're also disruptable in these specific ones. But basically, for the aggressive decks, you're just trying to kill your opponent very quickly. Where aggressive decks are sort of trying to take down the opposing life points quickly, control decks let their opponents keep the life points as long as they can keep taking away the resources. So these decks are all about managing card advantage, staying ahead until they spot an opening to take out the opponent, and they generally build up advantage over a few turns before going in for the kill. They're pretty good at denying the opponent access to additional cards off draws and that kind of thing, and if they're not going to be stopping you actually getting the cards, they're going to be stopping you from using the cards. So finally onto lockdown decks. These aim to put up a really big board, which is normally just full of monsters which are immune to or protected from a bunch of different card effects or attacks. These are the sort of Towers Turbo style decks, and although these days you could definitely fit Thunder Dragons into a list of lockdown decks, maybe it's not quite the sort of typical lockdown. So that's it for our list of attributes. As I've said before, no one attribute fully describes a deck, so by having this sort of list of attributes, it helps you to understand if you're capable of piloting a deck to its full potential. And that's because each attribute puts a demand on the player. Some attributes are more demanding than others, so let's now work out what is actually necessary for piloting decks with each of these individual attributes. So once again, we're going to go through the list of attributes, and now we're going to talk about the demands that they put on players. So linear decks, they require you to know the absolute perfect line of actions for your standard play. They might be interconnected actions, or they might be staggered. Either way, this is sort of the least demanding deck attribute, as you just need to know the basics in order to master this part of the deck at least. A player with 5 games of experience and a player with 5,000 games of experience will both get Alistair, Normal Summon, and Add Invocation. They'll understand how that works in exactly the same way. They might take some extra precautions in order to deal with potential hand traps and disrupts, but the linear part of the deck is essentially the same for both of them. Now, linear decks do demand you to understand each action in the basic combo, how it can be interrupted, and why the combo is established in a particular way. You could just learn it regardless of reasoning, but that leaves you in a sort of weaker position than you would find yourself in an unforeseen game state, so get that down and you'll be good. Where the linear attribute in of itself is probably the least demanding, memory-intensive decks require a lot of careful pre-preparation and practice. So your combos need to be absolutely perfect when you reach the event. They don't need to be original, and there are, after all, plenty of combo videos available on YouTube, but they do need to be rehearsed if you're going to have any hope of operating under this kind of pressure that you get in a tournament scenario. So memory-intensive decks take many hours of combo practice and testing so that you know what your goal is in any given scenario. It's all well and good looping 4 cards out of your opponent's hand on turn 1, but if they've already used up all of those cards, then there's no point going for that kind of combo. So let's say it's turn 2 and all you know about Goki is the Gunblast 4 loop. It's going to be totally pointless at that point. So you should be careful to learn what combo is relevant at what time, and after that you'll have this covered. Personally, I'm not very good with sort of memory-intensive decks. I don't have enough time to practice them properly, what with work and my life outside of Yu-Gi-Oh! Yes, shock, it does exist. So this kind of deck doesn't really fit me, but if you have a lot of free time, or you can pick things up incredibly quickly, then maybe memory-intensive decks could be good for you. They do have an extremely strong track record, at least over the last few cycles of the format, and all the different formats that we've seen. So, whereas you sort of need to know everything perfectly for memory-intensive decks, staggered decks don't put quite the same demands on a player. Instead of having to learn long multi-step combos, your moves are generally limited to one action at a time. So all you have to do is work out if that one action puts you ahead, or is it a waste of resources? So Sky Strike is probably quite a good example of this. If you resolve Widow Anchor, you aren't required to take a bunch more actions in order for it to pay off. You instantly know if it worked, and if you did the right thing. And you aren't waiting to see if there's a kind of new interrupt that will cost you the game. You play your card, and it works, or it doesn't, and then you play your next card. So staggered decks allow you to compete without having to use up loads of your time in testing to practice the same moves over and over again as you might expect from a long combo deck. You'll still need to know some of the basics, but your deck will be much more focused on understanding when is the optimal moment to use your card versus a particular opponent. This demands that as a player of a staggered deck, you are constantly aware of what you can do to bring victory closer, and that you can adapt to new circumstances quickly, as these will happen often. Generally, a single deck is more sort of focused on one of memory intensive or staggered. There's a long sort of scale, I guess, between these two decks of depending on what turn it is and what you're playing against, where it actually fits. I'm much more suited to the kind of staggered deck, as my available time is very much low at this point, but I'm happy to think on my feet mid-match in order to beat an opponent, so in that sense, a staggered deck fits me much better. But the advantage of memory-intensive decks is that the combos which players learn are generally enough to generate the victory in itself. So although you should definitely try to be adaptable mid-match, as this is good Yu-Gi-Oh! Practice, it's not always required, and you can kind of get away without it if you can become a good pilot of memory-intensive decks. Onto disruptive decks now. Since your aim is to deny your opponent plays, this type of deck typically demands that you think ahead of the event and really focus on your deck building. You know, what will be popular at the event, what do those decks lose to, and what cards can you run to effectively win your matches by stopping the opposing plays. These questions need to be answered as you prepare for an event with a disruptive deck. Draco players have been switching up their floodgates and other back row in order to take down the meta. It used to be 3 anti-spell in order to beat Pendulum, then we had the rivalry season in order to beat stuff like Go keyboards, and now we often see Erupt just because monster effects are pretty big. Each decision is made with the most common opponents in mind. That's your real focus, and it's this kind of understanding which is what the disruptive decks demand. Disruptable decks, however, should be looking at what disrupts are popular. They need to analyze their own combos and their typical plays in order to see where the weak points are and to know what popular disrupts would mean losing the game if they came down. With this knowledge in mind, players can tweak their actions in order to play around at different disrupts and keep their plays ongoing. Anticipation is sort of the major demand of disruptable decks. You have to know your enemy and you have to know what weapons they carry, and in this way you will know how to beat them. Aggressive decks, with their one aim to win in a single turn, also have to be wary of disrupts. However, for these decks you only need that one turn to win, so your protection that you have existing needs only to delay your opponent for a single turn. Instead of just straight up preparing for disrupts, you should think carefully about whether it's entirely necessary to protect yourself from them. There's opportunity to pack your deck with additional extenders and to break up your turn into staggered chunks, instead of relying on drawing into one of your something like 3 red reboots in order to blow out an opponent. You can also generally get away with not counting cards very carefully, because hand advantage doesn't really matter in the game if you're just trying to bring your opponent down to 0 life points. In this way, aggressive decks have the opportunity to be kind of blind to advantage strategies, because you just play cards that ignore popular disrupts and you go in for the kill. In this way, this type of deck demands that you can work out how to establish your victory based on different hands, different opposing boards, and different potential disrupts. You can build your deck and any combos to play around the disrupts, but you'll always need to be able to run the numbers very quickly and learn if you can do enough damage for game on the spot. So calculations and planning several steps ahead are very important for aggressive decks. Control decks. Now, typically these concern themselves mostly with advantage, so it's all about how many cards you have available relative to your opponent. That's how you see if you're winning. You need to understand when you play a card, does it result in you gaining advantage over an opponent, or does it trade 1-for-1 with their card, or does it actually put you at a disadvantage? Now, this isn't just in terms of current cards, but it's also in terms of future cards. So consider that you have MST in hand, your opponent has a set card. You can guarantee that by playing MST you'll be trading 1-for-1, or so you think. But what if their set is chainable? It could even be scapegoat, so you'd be using 1 card, your opponent would lose 1 card, and then they would get 4 cards. Essentially your action has set you back 4 cards in terms of advantage. It would be better to play a different card, something like Night Beam, so that you could guarantee going 1-for-1 with the chainable cards that are popular. This is exactly why so many Trickstar players were using Life Stage and then Phoenix to destroy back row, because it guarantees that you'll deny that card, which in the format had a strong chance of existing, from stealing the game from you. But we can't just consider raw resources. Now we also have to consider usability, which is where things get a little bit more unusual. So suppose you're playing Draco and your opponent is playing Sky Striker. They have 4 set cards which you think are all Sky Striker spells. Maybe you've seen them set them in previous points in the turn. Maybe they had like a multi-roll up or something. So they play Hornet Drones to summon a token. By flipping up Rivalry of Warlords that you have set already, you don't actually change the number of cards that each player has. However, you do change how many can be used. Your opponent now has 0 usable cards, and all of their Sky Striker spells are shut off, so anything that they have in their hand, which is a Sky Striker spell, is now pointless. And they can't even summon the Link monsters. So your 1 card has denied the use of 4 spells and the recycling of Kagari, and potentially even a search of Shizuku, maybe even a send of Hayate. In this way, you've denied at least 5 cards that your opponent would have had access to with just 1 of your cards. So in summary, if you want to play control decks, you need to know when your actions put you ahead, not just in terms of raw resources, but also in terms of potential resources. And it's also really good to know when your cards entirely win a match by denying your opponent a path to victory. So the last one then, the lockdown decks. So your aim is to establish a board that's basically unbeatable. So first you need to know what popular decks can do. You need to know, do they all destroy? Then Beals is a good card. Do they all target? Then maybe Chaos Max is a decent card in the format. Once you know which boss monsters to run, you need to have a build that can consistently play through disrupts in order to set up your best fields. Sometimes lockdown decks are also memory intensive, and you need to learn different ways to end on the variations of unbeatable boards that you can make, depending on what disruptions you face. But ultimately, when your boss monster is out, you shouldn't really care about much else with this kind of deck. The game plan is very simplistic. And this is the issue with many of the lockdown deck players themselves. So they spend all of their time trying to make difficult scenarios happen more frequently, just to get out one big boss monster. So you might have really particular requirements in order to bring out your boss. But ultimately, you don't build your deck in order to out opposing cards. This is the big problem. So the result is that lockdown players often really struggle against opposing boards. If they go second, they just can't beat it, and they can't bring out their boss monsters because the opposing cards get in the way. So their boards tend to be rather minimal because there's kind of nothing below the biggest level that a lot of lockdown decks can reach. And you can also often just lose from inconsistent deck design as well. To make this playstyle really work, you either need to have an unbeatable boss that guarantees you can kill an opponent, or you need ways to play through the opposing boards as a prominent part of your deck. I'd say that lockdown decks demand a careful calculation of what ratios to run. Pre-preparation of what boards to make when the boss isn't an option is a really big deal, and an understanding of ways to out opposing boards that comes up a lot. That is definitely something that you want to get your head wrapped around. So that's a lot of talking just to cover the attributes and demands. Now we're going to be starting doing some attribute fitting for our decks. Here's a bunch that I've assigned attributes to earlier. If you have any questions about why I've done it in this way, or if you disagree, please let me know in the comments, but the general idea should hold roughly true. So the final step is actually self-assessment. So what skills do you have that can meet the demands of current decks? Can you easily learn how to play around popular hand traps? Are you quick at calculating and can think several steps ahead? And do you have the free time necessary for learning memory-intensive strategies? So focus only on what you can actually achieve. There's no point wasting tons of your time on one deck if you don't think you'll be able to meet its demands in the long run. I've done this way too much in the past and it's been a serious issue. I love combo decks. Anything with more than 50 steps is absolutely awesome. Having the chance to sort of sit down, play through a massive turn that I practiced at home, is a really great feeling when you know it grants you a win. But I'm just not suited to the memory-intensive decks in the competitive scene. When I'm faced with a real-life opponent, I often screw up my own combos, I miss a step here or there, and I don't have time anymore to practice as much as I need to. However, I'm pretty good at understanding how to use my resources well, and I'm good at anticipating if a card will put me ahead. And also, once I've seen a hand trap hit me before, I'm very quick to learn if I can play around it. However, I'm also really bad at thinking too many steps ahead. From this, I know that memory-intensive decks and overly aggressive decks are really not for me. I don't have the time or the ability to pilot these particularly well at competitive events. I'd be much better suited to control decks, specifically staggered ones where I can take each action on its own and not have to worry about the consequences down the line. Now, I don't mind playing disruptable decks, as I'm able to determine how to play around a lot of disrupts anyway. So from this, a good deck for me might be something like Trickstar, Striker, that kind of thing, as you don't often have to think too far ahead. The usual plays are fairly linear, and your actions are all about staying ahead on resources until you can kill an opponent. Thankfully, I'm pretty good with numbers too, so this last part is really no issue for me. But forget me, what are your strengths and weaknesses? What demands can you meet, and what attributes would make your perfect deck? Once you've answered these questions, you'll be able to find decks that suit you best for when you want to go out and compete. One big thing about the best players is they play a lot. Some of us don't have the time for this, so we need to focus our efforts on just understanding a few strategies inside out. I say that you should learn about all the decks of the format if you can, and especially learn their weaknesses. But don't be very concerned with learning to play them all especially well. You can put that extra time into the thing that you actually want to focus on, and that way you can stay ahead in terms of what you're actually playing. Okay, I'm going to shut up in a little bit, so first I want to go over all of the steps once again. First, we define our list of attributes to describe decks and strategies. Then we looked at some of the demands that these attributes ask of players. Then we have to assign the attributes to popular decks of the format. Then we have to self-assess in order to see which demands we can actually meet as players. And finally, we have to find a deck which has all of the attributes that can actually fit our demands, or the closest thing. By following all of these steps, you can become much more competitive at the game, whilst also saving time in deciding what decks to play when you go to events. I hope that this video has been useful. Please do share it if you think your community would be interested. Drop me a sub or a like if you enjoyed the content, and stay tuned for more content from upcoming events, pretending that YouTubers aren't all terrible at the game. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.